Hello and welcome to the latest Science of Sport podcast. I'm your host, Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Conor Heeney. So Conor is a head of strength and conditioning and sport performance science at Liverpool John Moores University, which makes him the perfect person today to discuss how you adapt to your training. So without further ado, it's time to welcome Conor onto the show. So Conor, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. It's good to get on.
Oh, thank you for joining us. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Yeah, so I'm Conor Heeney. I'm currently based in Liverpool at the Liverpool John Moores University. My role there is it's performance sports science coordinator. I would say I'm sort of a multi-sport practitioner. We're talking, I think I've worked with about 46 different sports, so very broad range of experience. I've done undergraduate degrees in sports science, postgraduate degrees in strength and conditioning, and currently work with a lot of sort of boxers. I'd say a slight speciality in combat sports, whether it be MMA and boxing. So at the moment, we work with quite a lot of high-profile boxers at the moment. So that's a very quick rundown of where I am at the moment.
So we're here obviously to discuss training adaptation. So before we get into all of the different things that people can adapt to, can you give us a quick rundown of what adaptation to training means?
Yeah, I suppose adaptation is extremely broad, and it's a topic which you can go into a lot of depth, especially from physiology side of things. I suppose the purpose today is sort of trying to simplify as much as we can, and we can sort of look at adaptation as the process of change in which a person gets better suited to the environment, or just they change as a result of exposure to an environment. And that can either be positive or negative.
So what happens when that environment is training, right? So generally speaking, you're not going to, you will adapt to sitting on your backside. It just won't be positive. So let's assume that people are doing some training. How does that process work? So you train, you're tired, you get better. Like talk us through that kind of model of fatigue.
Yeah, I think when we talk about training, it's important to understand that training is meant to be put in place to elicit fatigue. So now fatigue is, if we want to define it, essentially means that fatigue is a decrease in performance of one of the systems in the body, a function, a process, a structure within the body. There is going to be a decrease in performance. So whenever we say we are training and we're looking for a positive training reaction, we need to make sure that whatever training we're doing, we are causing some level of fatigue. And that fatigue has to exceed, the training stimulus has to exceed the threshold for fatigue. You can almost think of it like if Usain Bolt was to walk from 0 to 100 meters, there's no way he's going to get faster as a training stimulus because that just doesn't exceed his already habitual loading. So when we talk about training, we're really just dialing in on where is the athlete's threshold for fatigue, and can we put in a stimulus or a stressor which is going to exceed that sort of threshold.
And then when you've got that fatigue, that obviously at some point has to dissipate and it has to recover again to come back to some higher level. But how does that fatigue then work? Because sometimes you've got muscle soreness for a week and sometimes you don't feel it at all. So how does that kind of fatigue come about and how do you then recover from it?
Yeah, look, the body is extremely malleable. It's very smart. It's a lot of what we talk about adaptation. It's evolutionary. It's survival based. So whenever you've placed any stress upon a system, and it might be a training stressor, as in you're in the gym, you're doing 10 by 10 German volume training, for example. That is an extremely high stressor to the body. That then means that you're going to put the body in a huge decrease of performance. Right? You've broken the system. The body then needs to find a way to recover. And what it does is it then goes through a process of adaptation. There'll be certain things that it will have to do within any of those systems to basically go, look, if you were to do that to me again, I didn't like it, and I don't want us to go through that again. It's very, very clever, right? It's very malleable. So what it will then do is understand what was the specific stress that you applied to me. So therefore, I need a specific response, which means then I can deal with that specific stress again. So for example, if we're talking about gym training, strength training, a clear one would be muscle mass. And if I was to go through that training stimulus, then I would go, okay, for me to be able to deal with this again, I need a greater amount of muscle mass. So therefore, then the response will be, I need to start signaling more protein synthesis, get my hormones up, so then I am better suited for the next one. I have to go through that recovery process. And we can sort of just coin that and term that supercompensation, where the body goes through that decrease, it returns to the baseline, but because it's got the insurance mechanism, it will go, I don't want to have to do that again, it will return to a higher baseline. So that's sort of that process in a very short sort of sentence. Long sentence. Sorry.
Excellent. It's a long sentence, but it could have been much longer. So we'll give you that one. You mentioned like different systems, right? So obviously there's tons of different stuff which is going in the body, and half of it we don't even understand. But like when it comes to like the key systems that which people are going to adapt to, what are we looking at then?
So you'll see in the course that I've done, we've got 11 bodily systems, and it's important to know that each one of them has its own individual job, but none of those systems can work independently. So even if we think that we are using our muscular system to be able to contract a muscle for whatever movement that we want, that's going to be dependent on the neurological system to be able to cause that contraction. We can't cause a contraction if we don't have the fuel source available for that contraction. So we need the digestive system. And then everything is sort of just worked around by, if we want movement, we're going to have to move the skeletal system. So there's tons of different systems we can adapt and that will be positive in terms of an adaptation that we want, which hopefully should lead to an improvement in performance. But it's understanding that, yes, we can adapt every single system, but they all work interdependently and intradependently.
And can you take us through the most important ones when it comes to like physical training?
Yeah, realistically, we're just looking at the skeletal system, so thinking bone density, bone mass. We're looking at the muscular system, so whether it be the amount of muscle we have, the quality, the way that the muscle is aligned, that might make it more suitable for high velocity or high force contractions. And then we also have the neuromuscular system. So how well is your sort of connective tissue? How good is your neural pathways to be able to contract those muscles? And then finally, we're looking at cardiorespiratory system, if we're thinking more endurance training and those energy system development systems as well.
And I'm rudely interrupting Conor to make sure you're up to date and aware of the Science Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you're enjoying today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes. You can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days in just a few minutes' time. What's more, Conor's completed one of those courses, so you can get some more great information on today's topic. And when it comes to then getting these systems to adapt, I mean, we won't talk today about how to elicit responses in all those systems, because that's going to be like, how do you do your job, basically, which is more than a short conversation. But when it comes to training and then the recovery from that, obviously those systems have different recovery times and different like adaptation times. So can you talk us through when you do a gym-based session, for example, what the expectations are in terms of recovery, or what if you do an endurance session, what you should be expecting then?
Yeah, and I think the answer that every S&C coach or lecturer is going to give you is it depends. So it's going to be highly dependent on the status of the athlete, the intensity of the training session, the volume of the training session they're doing. But we can think of it like, let's say we're looking at the neural system, for example. If we're about to engage in really high intensity, high effort sprint training or high intensity gym-based training, therefore our central nervous system is going to get absolutely fried. And that's going to take maybe 48 to 72 hours to be able to rebound from that, so we get back to baseline. If we were just to do a, let's say, low, steady jog, we might get back from that within 24 hours. You should be able to do that again. Other things such as if we looked at the endocrine system, for example, we looked at cortisol, which is almost our stress response hormone, that can rebound in 24 hours. But this isn't binary where we say, okay, we can rebound in 24 hours. If you're going through a month's work of unbelievably hard training, we've got an 8-week camp, that cortisol might stay elevated for 72 hours. Or if we're in an overtrained state, that might be weeks, months, depending on how overtrained that individual is. So there's nuance to it, but it's going to depend on the intensity and the volume of the training that we do.
And then when it comes to the adaptation from that, how long do those adaptations stay? Because I think a lot of the time people kind of assume that they're going to lose all their adaptations if they don't train on one day. Like
Sure.
what happens then when you stop training or you do take that time to recover? Is it a case of within a week you're not an elite athlete anymore?
No, it's going to depend on status, and it's going to depend if you do absolutely nothing. But we can think of it like the body has short-term and long-term adaptation. So a short-term adaptation might be, as you're going through that set, the heart rate increases. That's an adaptation to the training stressor. A long-term adaptation would be your heart hypertrophy, and the muscle mass within your heart will increase to a certain amount. That will stay for a very long time. We're thinking weeks, not days. So when we look at typically an athlete is going through a detraining status, what more likely is going to happen is their coordinative ability to perform that exercise decreases, but those physical adaptations typically stay for longer. Sometimes when we talk about slightly more high intensity activities, like your speed training, like your velocity based training that you might do in the gym, typically we would want to try and do this every single week, because we start to see decrements in the performance of those exercises, whether it be our neural pathways start to degrade slightly, because we need to say and we need to expose the body for those high intensity stimuluses, because we don't get that just during a normal day. So sometimes those adaptations can go really shortly, or sometimes they can last. And typically those structural adaptations will be a little bit longer than those neural ones.
And what are the kind of physiological underpinnings of that? Because there's a lot going on, obviously, and you alluded to it with 11 different systems that you have to kind of all allow for. But
yeah,
when it comes to the physiology of adapting to a training stimulus, can you walk us through some of the things which are going to happen within the body?
Yeah, so it's essentially a pathway, and the body is very clever. What it'll do, there's receptors all over the body. So if we take, for example, again, we're going through a hypertrophy phase. To be able to do that, we need to apply a certain amount of strain, a certain amount of stress upon the body. What your body will do, and as you go through that squat session 4x4, it will detect and it will notice an increase in strain upon the muscle. So what happens then is the body's very clever. It'll be like, whoa, I've had this massive alarm phase. And then what I need to do is start to increase, or I'm going to have to adapt the body to be able to handle that better. So you'll start to see increases in growth hormones like insulin, growth hormone, testosterone. And what happens then is it goes through a genetic sort of response pathway. So you have the hormone, then you start to activate different pathways. Those pathways activate different cells. Those cells essentially multiply, and then they are specific to the muscle that you're trying to adapt. So it's all through, you need a stimulus, you detect that stimulus, we send a pathway all the way down to the cellular level. Those cells, typically proteins, will increase and multiply. So then you have more of whatever you need to be able to cope with the next stressor.
And is that the same for different types of exercise as well? Because you mentioned gym training, but endurance training or maximum strength training or sprint training, does it work in the same way?
Yeah, it does work pretty much in the same way. So every single cell in the body is going to be made up of certain proteins. So dependent on the stress that you've applied, the response and the subsequent adaptation is just going to be specific to the stress that you've applied in the first place. So it will go through the exact same process. It will just be a different pathway and a different type of cell that we're trying to increase the number of or the quality of. So it's a very similar pathway. It would just be a different sort of route that we go down.
And when we kind of bring all this together, how do we use this information then to write better training programs or to recover better from programs? How do we then start to apply this information for athletes and coaches?
Yeah, so when we talk about writing better programs, I think the key is when we're talking about sports athletes, and I talked about it in the course, and I gave a shout out to another course that you've got on the Science of Sport Academy. It's all about knowing the destination. So the training program that you do has to be related to the outcome that you want. So that might be a strength-based adaptation. It might be a cardiovascular-based adaptation. It might be, I'm trying to improve my 5K. Now, within that, if I'm trying to improve my 5K time, there's going to be certain adaptations that are responsible for that, whether it be cardiovascular adaptations, respiratory adaptations, muscular, skeletal, whatever it is. There will be certain adaptations that lead us to that. And then we just need to apply the right training stimulus, which takes us down that pathway of adaptation. So it's to understand the first one is where do I want to go? And that will dictate where I start. The next part of it, which we talked about, is then understanding where the athlete is. So we have an adaptation we want. The next thing is understanding what's the baseline of the athlete. What are they used to? And how much stimulus or stress do I need to apply to be able to exceed that fatigue threshold? Because every single athlete is going to have a different amount of different fatigue threshold. So therefore, they're going to need slightly different requirements from a stress point of view. Then it's just applying the right amount of intensity and the right amount of volume to that training stressor. And finally, the final part of that is just maximizing the recovery of those athletes, monitoring the training response, monitoring the training load, so that we've said, we want to do this, we think it's good. Did we do what we said we would do? How has the athlete responded to that? Have we dipped them too much? Have we not dipped them at all? And then it's those recovery modalities that I talked about in the course, just sticking to the absolute basics so we can really maximize what's happening in those pathways, so we can get that adaptation that we want at the back end.
And can you walk us through how you've done this with athletes before? So obviously that's a great process. I'm interested to hear kind of the in-depth stuff as to what you're doing on a daily basis then. So if you've got an example case study, for example, you could talk us through.
Yeah, look, it's let's say we work with some of the higher profile boxers here. It's always going to start off with a needs analysis, understanding as much as we can about the athlete and the sport. That'll give us an understanding of what are the typical performance outcomes that we want. Then we think about what are the determinants of those outcomes. For example, if it's the amount they need to increase their amount of punches that they do, or they need a much stronger backhand because they're not quite doing the damage they need to their opponents. Therefore, we then can understand that maybe muscular strength and muscular power is going to be important. But again, that's just guesswork. So what we'll then do is profile that, assess that. That'll give us an idea of strengths and weaknesses. But most importantly, it'll give us that baseline to work off to go, okay, what's the training stimulus that we need? Then we will monitor that, whether it be velocity-based training, whether it be different types of jump profiling, whether it be isometric measures of force, and we'll continually monitor that to see how they're getting on throughout the training program. And then we look at some of those recovery modalities. So we stick to the big two, which is nutrition, sleep, and then you have other sort of secondary and tertiary modalities that you can use. BFR we've used with some athletes, compression garments, ice cold therapy, but it's important I'd say the caveat to some of those methods is that might blunt the stress response that the athlete's getting. So you have to be careful when and if you're using those modalities. So for example, if I have an athlete that 8 weeks from a fight, I'm not going to be wanting to use every single recovery modality under the sun, because therefore I'm going to blunt that adaptation. However, if I'm 4 weeks out, and our athlete's got 12 rounds of sparring tomorrow, and they've come and done a session with us, and they're already a little bit fatigued. So therefore we'll go, okay, jump yourself into an ice bath, do some contrast therapy, do some blood flow restriction, sort of passive recovery modalities. Make sure you get your 8 hours, get some downtime, so then you're ready for the subsequent session. So that's usually, and it's always a balancing act with a lot of these things, but just understanding what you want and how to get there.
Absolutely excellent. So Conor, massive thanks for your time and effort today. It's been a pleasure talking. Where can people find a little bit more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, look, I'm a bit of a recluse when it comes to sort of marketing and social media, but if you wanted to find me, I've got LinkedIn, so Conor Heeney, and then I've also got Twitter, so Heeney Conor. I think Heeney _Conor. So I'm more than happy if you want to shoot a message across.
Fantastic. Thanks, mate. It's been a pleasure talking. I look forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, no, thanks for the invite. Cheers, Matt.
Cheers, buddy. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks to Conor for all of his hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes and get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. What's more, every time you complete one of those courses, you'll get a certificate of completion, which will prove your ongoing education. And if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it'd be fantastic if you could recommend it to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. It means that we can keep bringing you the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, I'm Matt Solomon for Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.